Today, we're trying something we've never tried before. We've heard rumblings of it on the internet. It may or may not be real. It may break. We're not sure yet. We're putting snare side heads on the toms. We have put 3mm snare side heads on the Reso side of the 12 and the 16-inch toms today. For anybody doing the math, that is, depending on which drum you're talking about, either 1/3 or 1/4 of the thickness of the batters that we're using. Today we have a G1 on the smaller tom and a G12 on the larger. I'm not even going to guess what's going to happen. We've tensioned them up, and frankly, well, let's just get into it. Before we get into talking about the sound we're hearing, let's talk about how we got to it. I tensioned up the batters to where they felt good for me, and then I put on the Resos and I tensioned them up to similar intervals in terms of pitch that we would normally use when we're using our clear G1s on the bottom. Now again, G1s are 10mm, these are 3mm, so they are a fraction, a small fraction of the thickness of the normal choice. What this means in terms of the physics of this is that these heads are under dramatically less tension than they would be if we were using a 10mm equivalent. If we were thinking in terms of literal tension of the heads, all of this would be completely different. But for starters, we wanted to see what would happen if we just chose our normal sounds from each of the heads and put them to the test. Let's hear a little more of these drums in context now. The first thing that I'm noticing when I listen to the sounds of the drums in this configuration is that the 12 sounds closer to what it normally does, and I'm hearing a lot more nuanced difference in the 16. This isn't necessarily surprising because it's a much larger drum, so there's a lot more snare side head on there to affect the behavior of it being so much thinner. The second thing that we noticed when we started to get into different levels of dynamics on the drums is that they are speaking incredibly at very, very low dynamics, where before, if we had a standard 10mm Reso, we wouldn't be getting as much tone way down there. On the other hand, if we smack them really hard, particularly the 12, but both of them are starting to top out, they're choking out and kind of compressing when we hit them super hard. This isn't necessarily surprising because that head is offering a fair amount of resistance, but also not a lot of mass to push back and continue the sustain of the drum when we hit it that hard. There's also a massive amount of flex happening in that head, again, because it is so thin and thus under a lot less tension than a normal standard Reso head. These behaviors are somewhat expected given that we have experimented with various thinner than standard Reso heads on the toms before, but in this case, because they're so thin, all of these behaviors are much more dramatic than they would be with, say, a Reso 7 or something like that. One of the most surprising things for me, although now that I think about the mechanics of it, it's not that surprising, is that the tuning resolution of pitching up a snare side head on a tom as compared to a regular 10 mil head was super duper sensitive. The tiniest little turns were moving the pitch of that head a lot more than they would on a 10 mil, which was not necessarily expected by me because, again, we've never done this before, but turned into discovering that we had to be very careful when we were both getting it in tune with itself and also when we chose to start moving the pitch of the whole head at once. If you'd like to hear more, all of the demos from today and a whole bunch that you have not seen are going to be over on the Patreon. Follow the link below. There's a lot of content over there, and it's the best way to help us continue to make this show. Now we're going to try a second tuning where we bring the tension up on the resonant heads of the toms into a tension range that's closer to what we would normally use. And if we need to, we'll make some micro adjustments to the batters. It's worth noting right out of the gate that the overall pitches of the drums are going to change a little bit if we make adjustments to the resonant heads. And also, over the course of this, we discovered that if we were to go as tight as we normally would, these heads might not actually survive that kind of tension because, again, they're so thin, and we're talking about tension right now, not pitch. Everything that was happening with the previous tuning is showing up in this one as well. We're getting great tone at very low dynamics, and it is compressing almost more so at this tension when we start to hit them very, very hard. This makes perfect sense because with even more tension on the Resos, there's even more resistance against the energy that we're putting into the batter head, resulting in a shorter and shorter sound as we hit the drum harder. This beautifully harkens back to what we repeat and repeat here about over-tensioning the snare side head on your snare drum. When it gets too tight, we start to mash the ability of that energy that you're hitting the batter with to make the drum speak. In this case, there are no wires to contend with, but the issue is still extremely present. When we first decided to do this, we were thinking a lot about using an extreme like this to demonstrate the physics and behavior of the batter head and the resonant head working together on the toms and what it would mean to go to a super extreme with the Reso. The great thing about experiments like this is sometimes you prove your point or learn something new, and sometimes you also discover something amazing and unexpected, like how these sound and feel and behave at the super low dynamics. This means we have another tool in our pocket to use, especially if we know going into a certain playing situation that we're going to be playing very softly, maybe even with implements other than sticks. Sometimes power and intensity and projection is the goal, and other times tone and subtlety and dynamics and musicality is the first and foremost thing you're after, and knowing that this is an option is another thing that we can use to maximize that. In past experiments, we discovered that heavier and heavier Reso heads, given enough energy, could give you a lot of tone and a surprising amount of sustain. On the other hand, moving to something as thin as this means that we are thinner, less mass, and ultimately less sustain, but takes less energy to activate, which is how we get this amazing tone at the lower dynamics, which then translates to it not really being able to handle the more aggressive playing and gate out. None of this is necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely places this kind of setup in the extreme category, definitely a special use case kind of thing. And that's why, at the end of the day, having a 10 mil batter side and a 10 mil Reso side gets us the broadest set of options while never actually reaching those extremes that we may want on a special occasion. We hope this information will inform the next time you choose to swap out your Reso heads and maybe try something that you're unfamiliar with, whether it's thicker or thinner, and hopefully get you to an exciting sound that you haven't gotten before.